in U.S. history, all 50 states are under a federal disaster declaration. What went wrong and why? Are some still pointing fingers at China? And India is extending its nationwide lockdown, the largest in history, through the end of the month. Are the efforts working, and what fresh concerns are surfacing, especially concerning India-China ties? Welcome to The Point, an opinion show coming to you live from Beijing. I'm Li Xin. The U.S. has just had a very different Easter Sunday. COVID-19 has claimed more than 20,000 American lives as of Sunday, the highest in the world. And as of Saturday, all 50 U.S. states are now under a disaster declaration for the first time in the country's history. Now that the political and institutional failures that cascaded through the U.S. system are now becoming clear, and health experts are pointing out that time was indeed lost, Washington is making every effort to distract people from its own dysfunctions rather. How has the narrative changed among politicians and in the media, and what's at stake? I'm joined via Skype from New York by Ian Rafowitz, a history professor focusing on U.S. domestic politics at Empire State College at the State University of New York, and author of The Trivialization of Politics: How Rush Limbaugh's race-baiting rhetoric on the Obama presidency paved the way for Trump, and from Philadelphia by Brandon Blackburn-Dwyer, founder of the consulting firm Grasshopper Strategies, and in Beijing on the phone by Zhao Hai, research fellow at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. So, gentlemen, welcome to the show. Let's start with a rather intriguing recent poll that has been captured in the media in the United States. It's very interesting because it's a poll conducted by one of the oldest pollsters in the United States. It's a Harris poll, and we went into the document, and the poll that was conducted most recently and released last week indicate that 55% of respondents in the U.S. now blame China for spreading the virus. Now, however, when this piece of news was reported by websites such as Breitbart, the extreme far-right website, on Wednesday, that number somehow shifted from 55% to 77%, which we're not sure exactly how it came out. So, but according to the poll, it said that a net total of 23% said respondents said the Chinese President Xi was a trustworthy source of information related to the COVID-19 outbreak. If you divide 100, if you deduct 100 by 23, then you have 77. Maybe that's how the 77 number is calculated. So I want to go to Professor Rafowitz there. How do you look at what has been indicated by the results of this poll, and how this number and why this number was twisted by websites such as Breitbart to achieve what purpose?
Well, listen, Breitbart is a news website in quotation marks. Breitbart is really a right-wing propaganda site. It has a long history of manipulating facts, and even of literally making things up. In a recent book of mine, I discussed an incident where their founder, Andrew Breitbart, just deliberately misedited a video to make an Obama administration official look like she was saying the opposite of what she had actually said. And I won't go into any more details than that. This is the Shirley Sherrod incident. So Breitbart is a propaganda site. It's out there to drum up support for Republicans and also to stir the pot on racial issues in the United States. Look, there is distrust among the American population to some degree about China's response to the virus. And I'm not going to defend or support China's response. I'm not an expert on that. I think most of the governments of the world could have done a better job. Maybe South Korea, Singapore, Hong Kong have done overall a very good job. But clearly the Trump administration and right-wing media outlets that support it are interested in stirring up anti-China sentiment, and so it's not surprising that a right-wing website would be amplifying that that idea. And I believe also, I looked at the Harris poll results as well, that the mistrust was higher among Republican respondents. It was lower among Democrats and independents.
But what specifically is the point behind hiking this number of 55%, which is quite high, to 77%? What do you think they're trying to achieve to make it a fait accompli, or to make it sound that is the reality? So, you know, boys and gals, go ahead and, you know, continue, join the mainstream.
To some degree, I think you're right about that. I mean, Breitbart's audience is almost exclusively hard right-wing, Americans, and in theory international, but it's mostly a domestic audience. So if there's one thing that they want to do is they want to encourage their people to be anti-China. Well, the easiest way to encourage them, and not just anti-China, but other things as well, but on this issue, they want to make them feel like if they are feeling negatively towards China, that they're not the only ones, right? It's easier to feel like you're a part of the crowd if the crowd is 77% versus if the crowd is 55%. But you have to treat Breitbart as exactly a propaganda source and not a source of legitimate news. They manipulate data all the time. It's standard operating procedure for them.
I would like to believe that, and I would like to hope that there is not a wide audience to this kind of information, and yet we have seen actually a very dramatic shift in the rhetoric of the U.S. government, you know, a Republican president. And I'm going to go to Brian for this question. For instance, first President Trump praised China, and then, you know, he wasn't happy with some things, and all of a sudden he started to call this China virus, and then he praised China again, and Chinese masks were allowed to be imported to the United States, but then the threshold was made higher, and then the threshold was lowered again. So it seems there has been this shift in attitude towards China. Is that what has been leading the public sentiment as well? To arrive to this number of 55% of people thinking that China is to blame is still quite significant. Brandon, how do you look at that?
Well, first of all, let's talk about the numbers for just a second. I agree with my colleague that Breitbart is a source of unreliable right-wing news. But what is important about the Harris poll is we're actually talking about two separate questions in the Harris poll. There was a question that says, do you blame China for the spread of coronavirus? 77% of Americans said yes. It was a yes or no question. There is a second question in the Harris poll that says, who do you blame more, China or the U.S.? In that poll, 55% identified blaming China more than the United States, and 45% blamed the United States more. That means that if we deduce there's 30% of Americans that blame the United States more than China, but also blame China for the coronavirus, which on some level, if we're going to calm down a little bit about this, we can say that any country that was the epicenter of an initial virus outbreak would probably in the public mind be getting some blame. But what's clear is that President Trump has continued a xenophobic attack on China and on Chinese leadership to deflect blame from the disastrous response the American government has had to the coronavirus. This has included picking and choosing battles with the Chinese, picking and choosing battles with trade that you've identified, and now, on top of blaming China, President Trump has somehow decided that he's going to blame the World Health Organization for this. The Trump administration is engaged in a long-term battle to deflect any and all blame from his administration and the U.S. government on anyone else. And what he can do most effectively with his base of right-wing supporters is to add in a xenophobic element, hence his insistence on calling the virus the quote-unquote Chinese virus, which in modern naming conventions from the WHO on down is considered to be inappropriate because we no longer use the source of a virus, as we did with the Spanish flu, Ebola, or Zika, in the naming convention because it has negative response.
Yeah. Well, however, we have been seeing a wave of media reports, especially from the more liberal side of the media spectrum, coming out to really criticize very strongly the White House's clumsiness in handling of the coronavirus. For instance, this latest New York Times article says, the headline goes, he could have seen what was coming behind Trump's failure on the virus. It was published on April the 11th, and it says this is an examination that reveals the president was warned about the potential for a pandemic, but that internal divisions, lack of planning, and his faith in his own instincts led to a halting response. So there is no lack of these kind of rational and very cool-headed investigation. And yet, I want to go to my Chinese guest here, Zhao Hai, and yet it seems to me, these kind of voices seem not to be heard by a large chunk of the American population. Zhao Hai, what is your impression? Do you think these reports are really being read by a wide, part of the American population and having the kind of sombering effects that it should?
Apparently not, and those are traditional mainstream media. The audience of those mainstream media are shrinking and limited to very much the elite class in the United States. However, I want to go back to the poll first. I don't want to blame American people for misunderstanding China's role in this. And I don't really want to blame mainstream media in the U.S. because they're getting the information from the U.S. government. Most of the time, they cite sources from the Trump administration. So the result is that actually the Trump administration is lying about China's activities during this response to the COVID-19. And the purpose of doing that are twofold. Number one, just like Brian said, is to deflect, to blame others, to shift the blame to others, particularly to China. And that's very effective. And number two, they want to continue this long-term strategy of competing with China in terms of ideology and institution. And this is the golden opportunity for people like editor in Breitbart to blame China because this is a communist country. Therefore, it must be evil. So I think overall, if you add that together, the mainstream media, no matter how loud they are, they can't compete with social media that is turning out all kinds of blame against China and widespread of misrepresentation about China's activity.
What, however, I want to go to Ian sitting in the other end. What are all of these pointing to? I mean, we know the U.S. presidential election is coming up. How does that factor into all of this? A recent article I saw was on the Daily Beast. It says President Donald Trump and his allies are leaning heavily into a new 2020 strategy, tying Democrats and their presumptive presidential nominee Joe Biden not just to China but to its role in spreading the coronavirus. So will the ramping up of rhetoric against China, for example, ease up for the election?
Oh, no way. Look, I mean, when you want to know what Donald Trump's underlying game is on any policy, whether it's trade or the virus or anything else, it's always the 2020 election, always. So look, Donald Trump spent months and got impeached over a long campaign to falsely tie Joe Biden to corruption in Ukraine. He's now going to try to do the same thing, tying Joe Biden somehow to China and the virus and also to China more broadly. He released an ad last week that was a blatantly false ad showing Joe Biden standing with a Chinese American, Gary Locke, who was a former U.S. governor of Washington State and ambassador to China, an American politician, public servant, and sort of pretending that this Joe Biden shaking hands with this Chinese American man was somehow a sinister evidence of Biden having ties to the Chinese government. I mean, it's as racist as it gets. Donald Trump knows that China is not especially popular in the United States right now, and we can leave the reasons for that aside. He is going to race bait, and he is going to blame China for X, Y, and Z, and most importantly for the election, he's going to try to tie Joe Biden to China and to the things that he argues China is doing wrong. And that's how he scares the American people. This is what he does. He makes up things, he lies, he doctors evidence. I mean, this video is truly a doctored piece of propaganda. And Donald Trump is looking at the 2020 election and thinking the only way I can get reelected, given the performance I've had, is to make Joe Biden seem even scarier. And the polling is showing that Donald Trump's approval rating, after a small uptick a couple of weeks ago, is starting to drop again as his handling of the virus is correctly seen as a disaster. And his numbers against Joe Biden are particularly weak. If the election were held today, Joe Biden would win soundly.
Well, I hope that everybody will keep a cool head, look at facts from, different angles. If they see a very sensationalized headline, dive into it and see the nuances and find out whether you've been told the true picture. I think that is really scary, because you have really white turn into black, black turn into white. Brandon, how do you look at all of this that's going on? Because it's really quite extraordinary to observe it from China's perspective, to see how China's role is, or China's responsibility is exaggerated to such a point, and how that is being used to spin a certain narrative, to mislead a big part of the population to believe what they should. Because this effort, or this dysfunctional government, has costed a lot of lives by now.
Absolutely costs a lot of lives. It is also a president obsessed with finding a political enemy when he should be focusing on finding an actual solution that would save lives. Historically, we've seen the Trump administration degrade public trust in institutions, in the media, in the presidency itself. We've seen that and kind of accepted it. When President Trump would lie on trade and blame China wrongly for any ill downturn in the U.S. economy, we would say, well, you know what, it doesn't really matter, it's just economics. And now we're seeing it on a xenophobic, clearly racist level, when lives are hanging in the balance moment to moment, because he's so distracting the public that they can't even take serious advice from leading health experts because they're so caught up in his lies that people are dying because of them. And this is the travesty of the President Trump's administration and his mismanagement of our country for years.
Unfortunately, well, we have to leave it there. Many thanks to my guests, Professor Ian Rayford, Brandon Blackburn-Dwyer, and Zhao Hai.